Ancient Egypt looks monumental from a distance. But what did an average farmer's day actually feel like? The standard version says, everyone in Egypt lived in the shadow of pyramids and spent their time serving grand royal projects. Yet most of life was built out of repetition, practical skill, and the pressure of getting basic tasks right. If you followed an ordinary person from the moment the day began to the moment it ended, the biggest surprise would not be how exotic everything looked. It would be how structured life already was, even without the tools we now treat as basic. So instead of chasing the dramatic version of the era, let us track the ordinary routine from the first task of the morning to the last tired hour at night. The first minutes of the day already carried work inside them. A farming day started early because the heat punished delay. People woke in simple homes, checked animals, ate a small first meal like bread or leftovers, and moved while the light was still manageable. The Nile shaped the whole agricultural calendar, which meant an Egyptian farmer did not think only about land but about water levels, mud, and the timing of work. Those first tasks often decided how much room the household would have later. That opening stretch was not background noise. It shaped everything that came after it. Seen up close, Beat the Heat was not just a visual detail. It shaped mood, behavior, and the amount of strain people had to absorb before the day was done. That is why details like the early farm start mattered so much. They were part of the real pressure of the day, not decorative background somebody could safely ignore. With the basics handled, attention shifted to the work that could not wait. Once outside, work became repetitive and physical fast. Farmers hoed fields, guided animals, repaired irrigation channels, lifted water, and reacted constantly to the condition of the soil. This was skilled labor, not random toil, because mistakes with water or timing could reduce a harvest long before anyone saw the final numbers in a storage basket. Most of this labor happened without the neat boundaries modern people expect. Nobody had the luxury of pretending those chores were minor because the whole household rested on them. That is why details like irrigation work in the fields mattered so much. They were part of the real pressure of the day, not decorative background somebody could safely ignore. If you slow the scene down, the routine becomes easier to read. Most people were not performing for history. They were trying to keep ordinary life from slipping out of control. This is where the lived reality becomes more interesting than the myth. Food was simple and practical. Bread, beer, onions, fish, beans, and whatever else a household could secure were the foundation of life, not luxury meals. Storage mattered enormously because grain was not just food. It was security, taxation, payment, and a buffer against bad conditions, which made every harvest month emotionally important. Skill mattered here just as much as physical effort. That is why these routines deserve more respect than the stereotype usually gives them. If you slow the scene down, the routine becomes easier to read. Most people were not performing for history. They were trying to keep ordinary life from slipping out of control. Moments like this also carried quiet decision-making. People were constantly judging effort, risk, timing, and whether the household could absorb one more problem. By the middle of the day, the body was already paying for the routine. The body worked under sun, insects, damp ground, and rough tools. Linen clothing helped, but it did not remove the strain of repetitive bending, carrying, and standing in muddy conditions. Children were drawn into the world of labor early as helpers, watchers, and runners, because a farming household needed many hands long before adulthood officially began. Daily life was felt through skin, posture, smell, hunger, and sore hands. This is where a modern viewer can feel the distance most sharply. Moments like this also carried quiet decision-making. People were constantly judging effort, risk, timing, and whether the household could absorb one more problem. This is exactly where the era comes back to human scale. The famous headlines stayed far away, while regular bodies handled the actual burden of the day. But labor never existed by itself. Status, family, and reputation were woven into it. A farmer's day also sat under systems of obligation. Taxes, scribes, temple interests, and local expectations all pressed on the household, even if the farmer never saw elite life up close. That meant daily work was not just about feeding the family. It was also about meeting demands that came from above, and could become painful if the harvest fell short. Custom could slow things down, but it also told people where they stood. The era's values showed up here in a very practical way. This is exactly where the era comes back to human scale. The famous headlines stayed far away, while regular bodies handled the actual burden of the day. Evening made the logic of the day easier to understand. By evening, the workday did not simply stop. Grain still had to be handled, nets or tools repaired, animals checked, and tomorrow imagined before darkness settled in. The famous visual world of Egypt was real, but most people experienced it from ground level, as labor shaped by river water, family pressure, and the constant need to keep the household going. That last stretch often exposed what people feared losing most. By then, the routine had already shown what the society rewarded, what it ignored, and what it expected from regular people. What looks small from a distance often decided whether the rest of the day felt manageable. That is why ordinary routines deserve more attention than the stereotype usually gives them. Once the day is laid out from start to finish, what a day looked like for an ancient Egyptian farmer stops feeling distant and starts feeling lived in. For most Egyptians, history was not made under a giant monument. It was made in fields, storage jars, canals, and family routines that repeated for years. That is why the history of ordinary life is worth paying attention to. It tells you what a society demanded from bodies, homes, families, and time itself. Once you see the routine up close, the era stops feeling distant and starts feeling human.